Welcome to Bridging Asia, the Singapore Debates, a platform to deliberate the challenges the region will face in the 21st century. I'm Brendan Fernandez and I'm your moderator. Tonight's motion, President Barack Obama's re-election will be of no consequence to Asia. When U.S. President Barack Obama came to power in 2008, he gave not only to his fellow Americans, but also to the rest of the world, the audacity to hope. Now that his term is almost up, he appears to have little to show for the hope he ignited. With Asia poised to become the world's next superpower, will Barack Obama's re-election make a big difference to the continent? In our audience today, we have stakeholders, academics, thinkers, and business people. Earlier, we polled them to find out what their stand on the issue is. Currently, 29.2% agree with the motion and 70.8% do not. We'll be monitoring these results throughout the show. Let's now welcome our panelists. Please welcome the team proposing tonight's motion. First, Professor Andrew White, law professor at the Singapore Management University. Next, Dr. Deborah Elms, head of the Temasek Foundation Center for Trade and Negotiations at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. And now let's invite the team for the opposition. Mr. Jeff Watkins, president of the Singapore chapter of Democrats Abroad. And for the opposition, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. A former diplomat and Singapore ambassador to the United Nations, Professor Kishore is also the author of 2 books on America's relation to Asia and the world. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your panel for the debate motion, President Barack Obama's re-election will be of no consequence to Asia. Each panelist will now be given 1 minute to state their case. The proposition won the coin toss earlier, so they will begin. So, Professor Andrew White, are you ready?
Yes.
Your 1 minute begins now.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to start off by saying it's an interesting proposition, even though I support the proposition, but it assumes that President Obama will be reelected. And I have to say that as a Republican, I still do have some audacity of hope of my own that we may have a Republican in office rather than a Democrat in office next time. But that statement aside, I'd like to say why I support the proposition that it will have really no impact or consequence for Asia. And I'm afraid that my reason for that lies as much with the nature of the president and the presidency that we've seen for the last 3 years and what I project forward will be the next few years if, in fact, Mr. Obama is reelected. And that is a question of leadership. It's a question of ability to deliver on his promises. And I'd like to see whoever the president is, but if it is President Obama, I'd like to see him step up to the plate in areas of trade, in areas of security, in areas of leading the world in a liberal world order. And I'm not
Professor
sure
White, I have
that
to
he'll
stop
do
you
that.
there as your time is up. Thank you. So, Mr. Jeff Watkins, are you ready? Your 1 minute starts now.
Thank you. In normal times, U.S. foreign policy may not change much from president to president, as each president is confronted with the same basic hard facts of the world. However, these are not usual times, and all U.S. presidents are not created equal. President Obama has a unique Asia background and record of accomplishment. The Republican frontrunner's Asian policies, if they even have one, hardly show understanding of Asia's importance in global affairs and in America's future. As a result, this election does matter a great deal, especially for Asia.
Thank you very much. Dr. Deborah Elms, are you ready?
Yes.
Your 1 minute begins now.
Thank you. My argument would be, is a somewhat peculiar argument. My argument is that in this particular context, which is U.S. policy towards Asia specifically, it really doesn't matter who is elected, whether it's a Democrat or Republican, because The structure of U.S. interests in Asia will drive U.S. policy regardless of who gets the nomination and who ultimately wins the election. So it really doesn't matter in this case whether it is a President Obama or a President Romney or a President Santorum or any other Republican that you choose to name. U.S. policy towards Asia will remain basically unchanged in the next 4 years. Now, U.S. policy may be very different under a Republican administration in a lot of other areas, but U.S. policy towards Asia specifically, I think, will be largely the same whether it's a President Obama or a president of whatever Republican stripe you care to name.
Thank you. And Professor Kishore, your 1 minute begins now.
The United States of America has been around for 236 years. Since 1776. Not once has it had a president who lived in Asia as a child, who speaks an Asian language, and who has a sort of incredible deep cultural sensitivity to Asian languages and cultures. Finally, after 236 years, we've got one. And we've got such a precedent at a time when we're moving into the Asian century, when America will have to make very difficult and sometimes painful adjustments to adapting to this new world. We will see either a great divergence between Asia and America or a great convergence. And if President Obama is re-elected, and if he carries on for 4 more years, we will see the great convergence.
Thank you very much. Asia held its breath when Mr. Obama came to power in 2008 in the hope that he'd be America's first Pacific president. But with a floundering domestic economy and the raging war on terror, Asia was left on the back burner. So, does Asia matter, after all, in the overall strategic and political interest of the U.S.? Will it matter to Asia whether or not President Obama is re-elected? We'll leave it to our eminent panelists to address this issue. Throughout the course of this debate, you, the studio audience, can post questions to our panelists. We'll be taking some of the questions later during question time. You can also vote on the question you wish to pose to the panelist. The poll is also ongoing. You can vote on which side presents the more convincing argument. Each person has 1 vote, but you can change your mind and your vote as the debate progresses. We'll be tracking the poll through the course of this show. Up next, your stand. Each panelist is given 3 minutes to argue and expand on their point of view. The proposition began just now, so let's have the opposition start this segment. So, Mr. Jeff Watkins, your 3 minutes begins now.
Thank you. These are not normal times. We have China's rise and territorial aggression. We have the EU countries' falling credit ratings. We have the U.S. deficit, and political gridlock reinforcing each other. In these unusual times, presidential elections do matter. They matter a great deal, especially for Asia. President Obama understands that Asia is the most important region for global economic growth. As a result, it's critical to America's national interests. The reasons for this are many. From 6 years old until he was 10, Obama lived in Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim democracy and perhaps Asia's most important resource-rich emerging economy. Obama then moved to Hawaii and attended high school where many of his classmates were Asian or had connections to Asia. Let's contrast Obama's Asian background with the Republicans' background. Senator Rick Santorum was educated and spent most of his life in Pennsylvania and then in Washington, D.C. Mitt Romney grew up in Detroit, Michigan, studied at Harvard. As a member of the Mormon Church, he did a 2-year mission overseas to Paris, France. Newt Gingrich spent most of his childhood on U.S. Army bases in the United States and a few years in bases in Germany and France. Mr. Gingrich has a doctorate in modern European history. The contrast between Obama's Asian life experiences and the Republicans' lack of any New World experience is stark. Asian leaders are keenly aware of this contrast. Obama's pivot from old Europe to Asia is a reflection of Asia's importance. The pivot comes in many forms, placing troops in Australia, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and the talk of U.S. military returning to the Philippines. Enough about Obama's Asian accomplishments. What are the Republicans' Asian plans? Mitt Romney, from his website, from what I can see, has the most substantive foreign policies. and it even notes China's rise and says that the U.S. must make conflict with China less likely. This seems on track to me. However, when you go down further into his trade policy, it's introduced as in big, bold letters as confronting China. How? By designating China as a currency manipulator and imposing import duties. Romney says this will be done on day one of his administration. The problem with this plan is China will have no choice but to retaliate, sparking a trade war and further global economic downturn. A very wise man, Republican House Speaker John Boehner, opposes this plan, saying it is a very severe risk, has a very severe risk of causing a trade war. The fact is, Romney's Day One Asia plan creates conflict with China when the world's economy and Asian security can least afford it. In sum, these are not normal times. All presidents are not created equally, with Obama excelling in Asia. Republicans' Asia policies, if they have one, hardly show an understanding.
I have to stop you there, Mr. Watkins. Thank you very much. And now, Professor Andrew White, your 3 minutes begins now.
Thank you. It's interesting. I have to say this is the first time that I've heard Mr. Obama referred to somewhat as a possible Asian president, as well as being perhaps the first black president, the first Pacific president, and now it appears that perhaps he may even be the first Asian president that we have in some sense. The question is, what will Mr. Obama actually do? Should the United States be fully engaged with Asia? Oh, I think very definitely so. Should the Obama administration be fully engaged with Asia? Again, I think definitely so. Will the Obama administration be able to accomplish that, projecting ahead based on where it's been in the past? We see this administration engaging with Asia in a way that hasn't occurred much the last 10 years, but it's consisted of some bilateral discussions and negotiations about trade agreements. It's certainly there's been an involvement there. President Obama has been in the region. He spent, I believe, 10 days in the region. That's certainly important. But remember what he also has to worry about. He has to worry about what's happening in Iraq, what's happening in Afghanistan, what's happening throughout the Middle East, what's happening in Iran, what's happening with Israel, particularly vis-a-vis Iran. The security issues the United States is facing are significant issues, and they are global issues. They're not just in Asia, but they're also global. He's redirecting some of the military, obviously, to Asia. We hear that he's going to put 2,000 Marines, but it is only 2,000 Marines in Australia, and a question of what that's going to mean. What else is he facing? Double-digit unemployment in a number of states still in America, including my home state, North Carolina, and high single-digit unemployment in those states where it's not yet double-digit. Manufacturing issues that he's facing, unions that want to preserve jobs and keep jobs, and he has to balance with that. We're talking about Obamacare, health care issues that he has to face and resolve, tax issues that are being raised by the Republicans as well. That's before we even get to Asia. Then we come to Asia and we start talking about things like China's, some claim, currency manipulation practices. What does that mean? We want China to play by the same rules that we're playing by, that everyone else is playing by. There are issues of espionage, issues of cyber attacks, issues of human rights violations throughout the region. This is the kind of engagement that we would like to see the president have. Is Mr. Obama going to achieve that kind of engagement with Asia? Sadly, I don't think so. And if he doesn't achieve that kind of engagement, then what is that really going to mean as a consequence or as an impact on Asia and the relationship between the United States and Asia? I'm not convinced that this president is going to do much more than he's done the last 3 years. And frankly, that's been a bit disappointing from a Republican perspective especially.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
After the break, we'll continue with Your Stand. Members of the studio audience, please keep posting your questions and voting on the questions you want asked. Here are some of the questions we've received so far. You're watching Bridging Asia, the Singapore debates. The motion tonight, President Barack Obama's re-election will be of no consequence to Asia. Before the break, we heard from the first speakers from both the proposition and the opposition. Let's take a look at the poll as it stands right now. 33.3% agree with the motion and 66.7% do not. So there has been a shift in favor of the proposition. Now, for the next speaker from the opposition, we will have 3 minutes for them to state their case. So, Professor Kishore, if you're ready, your 3 minutes begin now.
Thank you. You know, the Americans have a wonderful expression. It's called a no-brainer. Now, it is obviously a no-brainer that Obama's re-election will be of consequence to Asia. And the reason is that President Obama will have 3 obvious advantages over any Republican president. First, as we explained earlier, Jeff and I, he's lived in Asia, he understands Asia. Secondly, he would have had lots of experience already. He's already met all the Asian leaders. He knows them personally. He doesn't have to work to build up a rapport with them. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, and this I'm responding to your point there earlier, when you say that America has lots of problems, I agree. But it is much easier for a second-term president to handle the difficult problems because he doesn't have to worry about re-election. And in that sense, he'll be a more effective president than any Republican president. And that's why it's important for us in Asia to have President Obama re-elected, because there are at least 3 big challenges any American president will face in Asia. The first big challenge is, of course, the biggest challenge of our time. How are you going to manage the rise of China? Now, this is for the first time in 200 years, okay? We're going to have a non-Western power becoming the #1 economic power of the world. It may happen sometime in this decade. Now, believe me, it is very difficult for the world's #1 superpower to give up its #1 position to a non-Western power. And to manage that, you need someone with the kind of sensitivity that Barack Obama has. Secondly, the other big challenge of our time, what are Western publics worried about? About the Islamic world. What is the threat from the Islamic world? Now, please go back and read the wonderful speeches that Barack Obama gave in Ankara, in Cairo. I read them again today. And you will find an extraordinary sensitivity and understanding of what the Islamic world is all about. No other American president could do that. And thirdly, if you look at Southeast Asia, which is where we are today, look at ASEAN, look at the important role that ASEAN will play. Believe me, the one American president who really understands Southeast Asia in a very direct way because he's lived here is Barack Obama. I can tell you that when the Singapore ambassador met him for the first time in Washington, D.C. after he got elected, he immediately spoke to an Indonesian, and said, "Apa kabar?" Which American president could do that besides Barack Obama?
Thank you very much. So, Dr. Deborah Elms, your 3 minutes begins now.
With all due respect to my colleagues, I would like to point out that the point of the debate is not which person should be elected President of the United States. That's a separate debate, and I'd be happy to have that discussion. The point of the debate is really to say which president is more consequential for Asia. If we want to talk about who should be President of the United States, we should have a different Bridging Asia discussion. But if we want to talk about who's more consequential for Asia, I think the argument that I've made at the beginning is it really doesn't matter who is elected. And we can talk a lot about whether or not Obama's background makes him more suitable for Asia. And I think in general you might say his background makes him more suitable for Asia. But I would challenge you to say, across the last 3 years, what difference has it actually made in his policies in the last 3 years? I would like to have thought it would make a vast difference in outcomes. I would like to say, as a result of his background in Indonesia and in Hawaii and so forth, we have seen him have tremendous success in Asia. But the reality is we've seen very little outcomes in Asia as a result of having Barack Obama as president. He has postponed his trip to Indonesia how many times before he came? We saw him postpone how many other trips to Asia in general? How many days has he spent in the region? Very little. I think if you want to say that this man, as a result of his background alone, is going to be a better president in Asia, I think that argument is relatively weak. Now, let me just also state that it doesn't matter, and the question came from the audience, does it matter who his opponent is? Yes and no. We're dealing with a general slate of candidates on the Republican side, none of which seems to be making foreign policy his personal agenda. And it's clear that the Obama administration hasn't made foreign policy their priority either, in part because of all of the discussions of the problems that Andrew and others have discussed. I mean, there's a lot of things on the agenda of the president besides foreign policy vis-a-vis Asia. And that's one of the reasons why I think that policy towards Asia specifically is not going to be a priority of whichever president becomes the next president of the United States, and why I think it doesn't matter as much as perhaps it ought which one of these gentlemen ultimately becomes president of the United States with respect to Asia. That doesn't mean that I think this is the way it ought to be. That doesn't mean that I think it's the way that it should be. It means it's the way I think it is going to be. Different proposition altogether. I think if you look at, again, the performance across the last 4 years, the statements of the people who are running for office, I don't see a vast difference between the candidates who are running, the Obama administration, and project that forward across the next 4 years. I don't think you're going to see a vast difference across them in Asia. U.S. national interests will drive U.S. policy in Asia, no matter who gets the baton of U.S. president.
Thank you. The panelists have all made some very salient points. We're going into question time now. Our studio audience has been posting questions throughout the show. Let's go now to our first question, which is an online question. A question for the opposition. Bush launched 2 major wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. If neoconservatives come to power in Washington, might there be a possibility of military action in flashpoints, such as in North Korea or in Taiwan? Question for the opposition.
Well, I got some good news for all of you. You know, if you look at the statistics on conflict, since statistics were ever kept, by the way, the number of people dying in wars is the lowest it's ever been, right? War has become a sunset industry, war between major powers. So the prospects of war in Asia have declined dramatically in our region. And I think, frankly, the prospects of war in the Korean Peninsula are very low. The prospects of war in Southeast Asia are very low. The one area that I would worry about, by the way, is the danger of war on Iran. And if there is, for example, an Israeli unilateral strike on Iran, I'm afraid lots of terrible things are going to happen. But if you leave aside Iran, I would say the prospects of the war are the lowest they've ever been.
Thank you. I'd like to throw that question to the proposition. What do you think?
The likelihood of war is decreasing all of the time. It's diminishing constantly. It's too expensive. It's too expensive in a lot of different respects, and we're finding that out. The United States is finding that out. The bigger question is, if the United States doesn't step up to the plate and handle these security threats around the world, who else will? And this is where I look to Asia. Will China step in and make sure that North Korea and Taiwan are not flashpoints? Particularly Taiwan, that's their flashpoint potentially. Will China help us and make sure that peace actually does continue on in this region? That's the question that I think we need to be asking as well. And I'm not entirely comfortable with that one. I'm not sure what will happen. That then puts it back onto the American administration to deal with it, whether it's Obama or it's a Republican, whoever it is. Will there be military action? I certainly hope not. I hope it's not necessary at any point.
Thank you for that. Let's see, we have a question from the floor. Does anyone have a question?
The United States is bankrupt. I don't understand why you're even asking about this. The United States is withdrawing from the world. And after the Second World War, the UK was bankrupt and they withdrew from east of Suez. The same is going to, who's going to pay for the U.S. to intervene in Asia?
Who's going to pay for it? I don't know. If we face that issue, we'll have to deal with it one way or the other. As a taxpayer, I certainly hope that I'm not paying for it. Looking at the economy and the fact that our economy is finally turning around and moving in a positive direction, I certainly hope there isn't anything else that comes along and retreats and pulls it back from where it's been, or back to where it's been, rather. Who's going to pay for it? I don't know. Again, this is the reason we need this region to step up to the plate. the United States can't go it alone in terms of leading the world. As I've said before, trying to maintain some sense of a liberal world order cannot simply fall on the United States to do alone. We need the engagement of China. We need the engagement of, ultimately, Indonesia, for that matter.
Ironically, in the short term, the Chinese will pay for it in terms of buying U.S. bonds. And we could have a whole other discussion about that topic, which is quite a large one, I'm sure. But I think the reality is in the short term, that's who's going to pay for it. In the longer term, hopefully, I'm a pessimist by nature, but I share some of my colleagues' optimism that eventually there will be some, what's already been known for many years, which is a combination of a balance of tax increases and spending cuts enacted to hopefully start bringing the budget under control.
Jim, I agree with you in many ways, but I don't think the United States is bankrupt yet. And as you know, if the United States had implemented what the Simpson-Bowles Committee recommended and begun to do that, there is a way to solve America's problems. There are some serious long-term fiscal problems, but there are solutions also out there. And that's why I actually think it's good to have a second-term American president, because a second-term American president who doesn't worry about re-election can then say, hey, let's do the right thing, what's right for America in the long run. And I actually, in the long run, I share your optimism about America. I mean, it is amazing how successful America has been. It's amazing how creative and dynamic the American population has been. I'm not pessimistic about America at all. But I do think at the same time that given the serious challenges that America is facing, this is the wrong time to change the captain of the ship. This is the time to keep Barack Hussein Obama on board.
Thank you very much. We're going to take a quick commercial break, but don't go away. We've plenty of questions from our studio audience, and please keep them coming. Welcome back to Bridging Asia, the Singapore debates. The motion tonight: President Barack Obama's re-election will be of no consequence to Asia. Before we proceed, let's have a look at the ongoing poll. Currently, 30.4% agree with the motion and 69.6% disagree. So this is in favor of the opposition. Now, let's take questions now coming in. An online question. Because of U.S. vested interest in Asia, its foreign policy towards Asia has shown more continuity than change. Don't you think that little will change whoever comes to power in Washington? That is a question for the opposition.
The big question is, do personalities matter? Right? And the simple answer is yes, of course it matters who's the president, because you have your own preferences. You heard President Mitt Romney say in his election campaign, I'm going to make Latin America a priority because Latin America is the future. So clearly, if President Mitt Romney says Latin America is the future, interests of Asia will suffer. And that's why it makes a big difference who's elected. And that's why I say the big advantage of having President Obama is that he's the first American president since 1776 to have lived in Asia, speaks Asian languages, understands the importance of Asia. Therefore, personalities make a huge difference.
Does the proposition have a different point of view on this issue?
Well, may be the case, but I would say, has it made a difference? Has it paid off? Yes, he may be fascinated. Yes, he may be a guru, but tell me how it has influenced U.S. policy vis-a-vis India. I don't see that U.S. policy towards India is any different under a President Obama than it would have been under a President pick Smith. Let's imagine there was a Republican President Smith. I'm not sure that U.S. policy towards India in the last 4 years would have been substantially different, particularly because U.S. interests, foreign policy interests, have been largely driven by particularly U.S. engagement in Iraq and Afghanistan, which has sucked all of the oxygen out of the room for the rest of the planet and basically concentrated attention on the Middle East and on domestic policy and on the economic crisis and meltdown in Europe and elsewhere. that I think no president could have looked elsewhere, no matter who it was. So the idea that somehow the president's personal inclinations make a big difference, I would like to think it makes a big difference. I would like to say, yes, this is really relevant. And at the margins, maybe it does. But I don't see that President Obama is such an Asian president, has such an Asian identity, that it wipes out all of the other things that are pressing on his time and has turned him into some kind of Asia first president. I don't see it.
You know, it's true that United States policies will be driven by United States interests. United States is not going to do anything contrary to United States interests. That's true. But throughout history, how you define the interests and what you do with them varies from president to president. Believe me, if Al Gore had actually won the election in the year 2000, there would have been no invasion of Iraq, because no democratic president like Al Gore would have invaded Iraq. It was very much an individual decision made by George W. Bush. So individuals do matter. And if you want me to give you examples of what Barack Obama has done differently to Asia, firstly, when he became president, all previous secretaries of state, when they became president, decided to go to Europe first on their first overseas tour. Hillary Clinton came to Asia. Maybe it was a decision, but I suspect Barack Obama has a slight influence on that too. Secondly, Southeast Asia has been trying for a long time to get US presidents interested in this region to do more. And finally, after years and years of lobbying, President Obama actually wanted to join the East Asian Summit and came for it. And believe me, the calendar of a US president is extremely full, extremely busy. They're always, his handlers are always trying to cut down his overseas engagements, but he decided to add the East Asian Summit because he said this is what's important. And what's interesting is that before he was elected, you could see when he went to speak in Berlin, the Europeans loved Barack Obama. And today, if you go to Europe, they feel somewhat let down that after all the love that they gave to Barack Obama, he's given more attention to Asia, because Asia is far more important than Europe in today's interest. Look at what he's trying to do with the TPP initiative. That's something new. He's pushing for it to say, okay, let's see whether I can make a difference with that.
On the TPP, on the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks, if you wanted to say the president has a special affinity for Asia, then I would say to you, why did it take him so long for the U.S. to actually engage on the TPP? It took him, the talks were announced by the Bush administration in 2008. It took the United States until 2010 to actually engage in those talks. And then they basically just sat around and discussed whether or not they were really serious about this for another 6 to 8 months. And they didn't really get serious about engaging in those talks until the end of 2010. If you were really serious about engaging in Asia, this is the only trade game in town. This is the only economic engagement the United States has in Asia. You would have said, or I would have thought, that an Asian-focused president would have said, this is my priority. This is where the action is. This is where the game is. Let's get ourselves in this in a big way, and let's put all the resources that we can into this from day one. Let's not wait until 2 years, 3 years into my administration and then say it's important to us. And you would have seen a very different movement of that negotiation moving forward. You now have 3 countries lining up to join: Japan, Mexico, and Canada. If you had a true Asian president who was enthusiastic about this region, the United States would be leaping up and down to get Japan involved. They are not. I find that puzzling. I mean, again, I think there are a lot of signs and symptoms that say that while he may have sympathy towards what is going on in Asia, this is not someone who is embracing Asia in a way that you might have expected. So I'm not sure that he's gone that much further than what I would expect any sort of sensible president should have done.
Thank you for that. In the interest of time, I do have to move on now. I'd like to take a question from the floor because I see people are... Yes, that gentleman there. Thank you for that.
Yes, hi. My name is Andy. I'm from Capelin. The question is, given that resources are limited, all presidents would be limited, whether it's a Republican president, whether it's a Democrat president, or whether it's Mr. Obama, actually. So my question now is, would Mr. Obama, compared to all the other three frontrunners, for the Republican candidate vote, would he have actually a higher priority for Asia than the other three? And how about the quality of engagement? Don't just talk about the quantity, but the quality of engagement. Does it come out of a need of foreign policy, or does it come right out from the heart?
I'll make a quick observation and comment in response to your question as well. I think that Mr. Obama has engaged with Asia on a very friendly basis. He is spending time here. He spent 10 days here. He was in Bali for the summit. That was a big deal. Of course, the summit's only 5 years old, so it would be a little hard for another president to have spent much time there. But he's definitely making friends in the region. It's something Mr. Obama's actually very good at doing. He runs around the world making friends. I think that's part of why Europe's a little disappointed, because he made friends with Europe too, and then he sort of let them down a bit. That's why a lot of people in America are a little disappointed. He made friends with all of us, and he's kind of let us down a little bit as well. So it's a real question. What is his actual priority for Asia, though? What is he really going to do in the future? You mentioned President Mitt Romney, and I kind of like the sound of that, and I'm glad you said that about 4 or 5 times. And I hope you keep saying that. And Jeff, I'm delighted to know that you don't care who gets elected, because I'd certainly like to invite you to vote for President Mitt Romney as well. But what has his position been, and what has been the position of the Republican candidates? It's not just let's make friends in Asia. It's let's hold their feet to the fire a little bit. Let's look at how things are going on in China and other parts of Asia as well. Let's talk about human rights violations. Let's talk about problems with cyber attacks and espionage. Let's talk about some of the intellectual property rights that we want to see protected, so that we can continue to have all these wonderful dialogues with the type of technology that we have today. Let's talk about how parties can win government contracts in China. Let's talk about the rules for corporations and companies doing business in China, and let's talk about some transparency for that. That's what the Republicans actually would like to see more of. Mr. Obama wants to make friends with everybody, but is he going to actually, as a good friend should do, take his friends aside at some point and say, come on, folks, it's time for you to step up to the plate and do things the right way? We haven't seen much indication of that.
Thank you. I'd just like to draw your attention to the ongoing poll. It now stands at 38.5% who agree with the motion and 61.5% who disagree. And has moved again to 42.3% who agree and 57.7% who disagree. So, it seems that while more of the audience still favor the opposition, the proposition is chipping away at that lead. With that in mind, let's take one more question from the floor. The gentleman in the first row, please.
It seems also to me that the U.S. is in a unique position to act as a mediator in the event a dispute were to break out between India and Pakistan in particular, but also India and China. Who do you think would make the biggest difference, the Republicans or the Democrats? And I'd pose that to both parties, please. And why? Specifically, why will they make a difference?
I'd invite the proposition to begin.
If we had a Republican in office, we'd be able to mediate it from a very different perspective. Some of that is a little bit of the speak softly and carry a big stick concept. And I think that if we did have, and again I'll say it because I like the sound of it, President Romney in office, I think that America would have a different, the world view of America would be different. I think we would be seen as a force to be reckoned with, not as a force which has been somewhat neutered or neutralized the last 3 or 4 years. And that might help us mediate disputes in that region as well. The problem is that a dispute that involves India and Pakistan, or God forbid India and China, I don't know how you mediate that. I don't think it doesn't turn into much of a win-win.
Well, I think I agree that we should pay equal attention to India. In fact, the Asian century is not just about the rise of China, it's about the rise of China and India. And it's also very, very clear that the US has been tilting towards India very significantly. You know, the US has legitimized the Indian nuclear program. allowed the nuclear suppliers group to provide materials to India. And if you look back historically, over the last 20, 30 years, the historical record always was the United States trying to play a balancing game between India and Pakistan, trying to almost like treat both sides equally. But now it's very clear, I think you can see this very clearly in the Obama administration, that he's clearly decided that India is number one priority. You look at the amazing reception that Prime Minister Manmohan Singh got in the White House when he went there for the state visit. North Pakistani has got that treatment. And if you look at the tensions in the relationship between the United States and Pakistan, which by the way are very real, they're very, very real tensions with the United States and Pakistan, all that's created a geopolitical environment which is advantageous for India. So, from India's point of view, as they look ahead over the next 4 years, and if you ask them privately, would you like to see Barack Obama re-elected? Or would you be happy with the new Republican president? I suspect they would probably want to see Barack Obama continue in office because they have a very good personal bonding with him. They've seen a policy that has worked in their interests. And they also believe that he understands the complexity of the region. It's a very complex region. You have to have some knowledge of history, some knowledge of what's been going on in the past, and therefore you can handle these things sensitively. Barack Obama has that. So I think for that reason, I suspect if you did a private poll of the Indians, they would probably agree with us that Barack Obama's election will be of significant consequence to Asia.
Thank you very much. We receive a number of questions from our studio audience, and our panelists have gamely tackled them head-on. But have the panelists swayed the opinion of the audience? Coming up is the final word. Stay tuned to Bridging Asia, the Singapore. Welcome back to Bridging Asia, the Singapore debates. The motion this evening, President Barack Obama's re-election will be of no consequence to Asia. It's time now for the final word. I would request each speaker in turn to sum up in 1 minute what their final thoughts are. Starting with the proposition. Professor Andrew White, your 1 minute begins now.
Thank you. I don't actually need a whole minute. I think I've pretty well stated what my views are, and I just want to reiterate, I do agree that Asia is on a wonderful, fast upward trajectory. There's a reason why I choose to live here. There's a reason why many of us choose to live here, and we're excited and enthusiastic about what we see happening here. The question in the proposition, however, is whether Mr. Obama, if he is reelected, will have any impact, whether that'll be much of a consequence for Asia. And I think the sad reality is that it could, but we probably have the wrong person then sitting in the White House for it to be a meaningful consequence for Asia. That's really the gist of the proposition as I see it. If we had a different president going forward, I think it might make a difference, but not with this president. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor White. Now over to the opposition. Mr. Jeff Watkins, your 1 minute begins now.
Thank you. Very stressful. Thank you. As I said, these are not normal times. We have China's rise in territorial aggression. We have EU's falling credit ratings, and the deficit and political gridlock. And these are unusual times, and presidential elections matter. It matters a great deal for Asia. The Republican candidate with the most substantive policies I could see are Mitt Romney, and if his main policy is imposing import duties on China, I think that would be a disaster. That would start a trade war, worsen the economic environment, and create a conflict with China when we can least afford it.
Thank you, Mr. Watkins. Over to Dr. Deborah Elms. Your 1 minute begins now.
Thank you. I think the one thing that we haven't mentioned that is really critical to understand is that in addition to U.S. national interests driving U.S. policy, the other thing that drives U.S. policy is the moderating influence of Congress, which will severely handicap or restrict U.S. President abilities, no matter which president gets in office. So while I would like to argue that the U.S. has a lot of flexibility, U.S. president has a lot of flexibility on things like human rights, has a lot of flexibility on things like trade policy, could name someone president, could name China a currency manipulator on day one, I think ultimately it's going to have to get through Congress, and whatever the president would like to do is ultimately determined in part by what Congress decides it will allow the president to do. And I think that plus U.S. national interest is going to restrain whatever impulses a president may have or may not have. And ultimately, it doesn't matter who is in the White House, U.S. policy towards Asia will be largely unchanged.
Thank you, Dr. Elms. And Professor Kishore, your 1 minute begins, one moment, right now.
Well, for my final remarks, I would like to read to you what the motion says. It says Barack Obama's re-election will be of no consequence to Asia. Now, how can you argue that? How can you say it will be of zero consequence to Asia? As we explained, my partner and I, he knows Asia, he's had experience, he'll be a second-term president. And so it's very clear that Asia will be much better off if Barack Obama is re-elected. Now, this doesn't mean, by the way, the question is not whether we should have a Republican president or a Democrat president. You can argue whichever side of the fence you're on. The question is, what will be the impact on Asia? And here, clearly, if Barack Obama is re-elected, Asia will be better off.
Thank you, Professor. You've heard from all our panelists. They've had their say. Now you have yours. Please cast your votes now. Choose if you agree or disagree with the motion. You have 2 minutes to do so. The votes are in and the audience has decided. Now, at the start of this debate, 29.2% of our audience members had polled for the motion and 70.8% had polled against. Let's take a look at the final tally. We opened the polls again during the debate, and 32.4% have polled for the motion and 67.6% have polled against. And so the winner is the opposition. Congratulations to Mr. Jeff Watkins and Professor Kishore Babubadi. You have convinced the audience that US President Barack Obama's re-election will be of consequence to Asia. Thank you very much. Congratulations. Professor Andrew White and Dr. Deborah Elms, thank you for being part of Bridging Asia, the Singapore debates. You've also given us a lot to think about. Thank you. The U.S. is in the throes of economic contraction and is now struggling to reassume its leadership role in the region. The upcoming presidential election in November will determine if President Barack Obama, who had fired up the imagination of millions around the world, will be able to carry through his campaign promises of hope and change. Asia, meanwhile, will watch these developments closely from the sidelines as the U.S. is heading towards a crunch point in reshaping its relationships with Asia. On that note, let me thank all our distinguished panelists, our members of the audience, and all our viewers watching this debate. Find out more information on the debate and make your stand on today's motion by visiting our website, channelnewsasia.com/bridgingasia. Thank you and good night.